Welcome to the Shepherds Network podcast, a podcast from Abundant Life Church located in Syracuse, New York. In this podcast, we'll explore the heart, the soul, and the spirit of what it means to be a minister. In this podcast, you'll hear conversations with different leaders, from industry experts, stories from other shepherds, and insights from ministers to equip you with the practical and the spiritual principles you need to thrive on your ministry journey. Thanks again for joining us today. Let's dive into today's episode.
Welcome to the Shepherds Podcast. It's great to have you with us. This podcast is by shepherds for shepherds. And if you are pastoring a church, if you're a ministry leader, the particular kind of leadership that is unique to pastoring and to ministry, this podcast is for you. And today we are going to minister on a very powerful topic. I think that our conversation today is going to really help you, whether you're starting out as a church planter, you're pastoring an existing congregation that's been around a long time, you're in transition, wherever you are in your, shall we say, your pastoral, your shepherding adventure. This is a topic that if you haven't come up against, you certainly will, and it will be a major theme for your life. And I'm going to talk to you about pastoring through loss and grief. Pastoring through loss and grief. And I think we all need to recognize as shepherds that being a pastor is not for the faint of heart. It's not the safe career option. It's not the simple thing that just was sounded like a fun thing to do. We like church and we like to talk, so I think we'll be a pastor. The Bible says that to be a shepherd or a pastor is to be divinely called by God. It's to have an experience where you surrender your entire life, not just to Jesus. That's what you do when you get saved. At least that's what you're supposed to do. But it's surrendering your total life to the service of the body of Christ. You're being chosen by him and acknowledging that calling to actually pour out your life on behalf of the people that he poured out his life for. And at a level and to a degree and to an extent that the average believer is not required to do. You know, one of the things the Lord had me do a few years ago is go through all of the sermons of Jesus and to categorize them and to notice the audiences. And I was amazed to discover that more than half of the sermons of Jesus were not to the crowd. They were to leaders, either the 70 or the 12. In a few cases, he would have private sessions with his disciples and some of the Pharisees. But the vast majority of what Jesus said, in fact, more than half of what Jesus said, wasn't to the crowd or to the congregation. It was to the people he was training to lead. And if you look at what he said to his leaders, it's different than what he said to the crowds. He laid a responsibility on those of us who shepherd that's greater. And so we need the grace of God and we need the wisdom of God to really be able to carry out that mission as we represent Jesus to our flocks and to our churches. And pastoring is not an easy thing to do, especially in today's world. It's a contact sport. You take a lot of hits and you experience a lot of losses. As great as the victories are, anybody that's pastored will tell you there's also a lot of pain as well. Sometimes the pain immediately follows the victory, but it's always there. Everyone experiences loss. Everybody experiences losses, but pastors experience it on an exponential level because of the mission that we're called to fulfill. Our job is literally to help people through their lives and their losses. We help people through the loss of their loved ones, the loss of jobs, marriages, children. We guide people through in counseling through the loss of their innocence, very often the loss of their childhood. We're dealing with the losses of people all the time at a level that most people cannot even begin to relate to. Not even your deacons or your elders can relate to the role that you as the senior pastor have in this regard. And in addition to all of that, we have to navigate our own experience with loss. And as pastors and shepherds, we have to acknowledge some of the things that we lose. We lose the loss of our privacy. You're never actually completely private anymore. Everything is not only open to God, it's open to our elders, to our leaders, what we do in public. We lose our public anonymity. It's not like we can just go to the store anymore and not assume that someone hasn't heard us or seen us or knows us. We lose in some ways, our ability to react to painful and annoying things like normal people do. You know, if I'm in public and somebody comes through and makes a statement that's kind of rude, I'm not free to just respond in an equal fashion. I always have to be on when I'm in public. And you know, pastors are like anybody else. We have the same thoughts and feelings as anyone, but we don't have the same freedoms that believers do who don't experience this unique call to leadership. We lose our church members. If you've pastored for any period of time, even if your church is growing and blowing, I can promise you, you're losing people, and you will lose people. You lose staff members and friends. You lose your weekends for the rest of your life. You lose programs that were successful at one time, and then they're no longer successful, and you have to let them go. We experience the loss of our freedom to walk away from our job. You know, an average career, if it's not working out, you can always quit. It's not quite the same with shepherding, not if you understand the call of God. You can't just do what you want to do. Your life is surrendered to Christ and to the people He's called you to serve for as long as He's called you to do it. And so in all of that, we're navigating our own losses, helping people through theirs. And then if we're married and we have children, we have to help our spouses and families navigate their losses in life that happen automatically in the middle of the ministry bubble, the bubble of ministry, which is you're always under being watched. Any of us that have kids know that it's a different experience. There's a psychological dynamic. We'll deal with this when it comes to raising kids in ministry. And all of that is something that we just need to put out there and talk about. So this podcast today, we're going to talk about how do we deal with loss, our own loss, the loss of others in our congregation. How do we as ministers process loss and grief? Do we process it? And if we do, how do we do it in a healthy way? And I think, you know, I know that I've had some incredible losses while I was pastoring. My mother died suddenly and shockingly. My brother died in the same, very similar, fast, shocking way. I wasn't able to say goodbye to either my mother or my brother, and I had to get up and preach shortly after the funerals and had to conduct the funerals in front of the whole church. And, you know, as pastors, it's not like you have the freedom to just sit down. At least often we feel that we don't have that freedom. So we want to talk about that. Now, today, I have with me a tremendous guest. He is a great father. He's a great husband. He's a great friend. He's been in ministry for over 39 years. He served as a college professor, church planter, pastor, international speaker. He's an ordained minister of the Christian and Missionary Alliance denomination. And for the last 24 years, he has trained literally thousands of ministers as the dean of my seminary that I just graduated from, Alliance Theological Seminary in Manhattan, New York. And I'm speaking to Dr. Ron Walborn. Ron, it is great to have you here today.
Thank you, John. It's great to be with you.
And Ron, just tell us a little bit about your story, your journey in ministry, and as we kind of step into this topic.
Well, I was raised in a ministry home. My dad was a pastor in Western PA, and I can remember as a little boy coming home from church and setting up my stuffed animals and preaching my dad's sermon at my stuffed animals and taking an offering and giving an altar call. And, I knew there was a call in my life.
It was just in you.
Oh, yeah. I knew. Now, I ran from that calling in my teen years, as some of us tend to do, but I just knew that it was in me and on me. And then in college, the Lord, confirmed that call, and I actually married a woman that has a stronger call in her life than I do. I kind of planned that. I knew I need somebody to hold me steady, and so Wanda also has a very strong call to ministry. After seminary, we pastored a church in Connecticut, and then after 3 years moved to California and planted a church in Redding, California, and a church that was wildly successful, but it also represented a season of loss for me. Because when we planted that church, I felt like the Lord promised me 10% of the city of Redding, which is a city of 80,000.
Okay.
And
Redding, I think a lot of the folks that are listening are
Redding,
going to know
California.
that's where Bethel churches.
Yeah, Bethel.
Bill Johnson, was he pastoring at the same time?
He wasn't there initially when we started,
Yeah.
but then he came about midway through, and we became very good friends, and we're part of the renewal movement together. And so, I mean, by all accounts, we had success during those 10 years in Reading. The church grew to, I think the last Sunday I was there, we had 1,100 people.
That's phenomenal.
But I was disappointed because instead of, the 8,000, we had more like
10%.
Yeah. And so, no one understood the grief that my vision did not get fulfilled. And so...
And that's a loss too, isn't it?
It was a loss. And so there was grief connected with that. And then God called us to come back to Nyack College.
Just real quick,
Yeah.
when you had this in your heart for 10%, right?
Yeah.
8,000 people, roughly. Did you communicate that to your church?
I didn't. I didn't want to be seen. I think I wanted to avoid the Joseph thing. Oh, look at him, because sometimes we reveal too much of what God shares early on. I remember when I first got filled with the Spirit in 1987, I came back and I called all the district superintendents and I said, I want to come to your district and I'm going to plant a church where we see, the captives set free and people are going to get transformed and we're going to see people filled with the Spirit and healed and maybe even the resurrection of the dead. And they all looked at me like I was crazy, and I was. But I shared a little too much of the vision God was stirring in me too quickly. And that sets you up for loss and disappointment too. You have to be wise about what you share.
Continue with your story. We'll get back to some of these.
So then after 10 years in Reading, God called us. I knew I wanted to have an impact on our entire denomination.
Okay.
I knew that I wanted to lead the CMA into renewal. And I didn't know how to do that. We did part of that through the church that we planted that was moving in renewal.
And for those pastors who are listening that may not be familiar with the CMA, just started by A.B. Simpson.
Yeah. The Christian and Missionary Alliance was birthed in healing, the gifts of the Spirit, freedom of the Spirit, and then there was a reaction to the Pentecostal movement that caused us to swing the pendulum the other way for most of the 20th century.
Okay.
And so when I got filled with the Spirit in 1987, initially I was going to leave the Christian Missionary Alliance and go with the Vineyard. And I had a phone conversation with John Wimber, and I had a dream the night before. And in the dream, I saw this fighter plane, and I knew that was the Vineyard. And I went, oh, yeah, Lord, I want to fly one of those. And then I saw a steam train chugging along. And I saw A.B. Simpson, the founder of the Christian and Missionary Alliance, driving this steam train. And I looked at it, and he looked at me. And the Lord spoke to me and said, that's the Alliance. It's not real fast, and it's not real flashy, but it's headed toward the kingdom, and it's got lots of horsepower, and I want you on it. And so I told John that story the next day in our phone conversation, and he said, yeah, Ron, he said, I was led to the Lord by an Alliance pastor.
Wow.
And we just practice what you guys believe theologically.
Yes.
And they need a renewal agent to take them back to practice what they have a theology for already. And so that's when the Lord, and so I made a deal with God. I said, all right, I'll stay.
Okay.
And I'm not going to hold back. I'm going to do everything, you called me to do. And if they fire me, you have to promise to bless me. And I've done everything I could to get fired for the last 35 years. And he keeps blessing me and promoting me and within that denomination. And we've seen great growth and great progress.
And you were now, while you were pastoring, were you teaching at?
I was a youth pastor first in Connecticut, and then I became an associate pastor and a lead pastor. And then we moved to Reading, and I started teaching at Simpson University in Reading, California immediately. And so we saw, again, great success, but great loss and disappointment along the way as well.
So when you left Reading did you come right to New York at that point?
So I taught for 10 years at Simpson University while I was pastoring Risen King Community Church in Reading. And then we came to Nyack, and I started teaching immediately in the pastoral ministry department at the undergrad. And then after 4 years of that, I was asked to be the dean of the undergrad in 2004. And then in 2008, I became the dean at the seminary. Now, the reason I did that, though, was the Lord spoke to me and said, if you want to change a denomination, change the hearts of the students. Yes. If you capture the hearts of the students in the next generation, you will change the direction of a denomination. And I've seen that to be true. because no matter where I go in the world, there's people that I poured into over the last 30 years at Simpson and also at Nyack that have gone out and kind of carried the message of renewal. And so there's been great progress. I'm encouraged by it.
Well, it was 2015 in September. You were attending church because Dr. Walborn's son actually is a member of our church. Bryce, he's a great young man, and you were here visiting your family, and you came up after service. It was in September, early September, and you said, "John, we're starting an online master's program."
That's right.
And you said, "I can get you in." And instantly the Holy Spirit spoke to me and said, "That's what you've been waiting for, because I've been wanting to finish or go to the next level of my education." So I've been in a program, and during COVID, we kind of had a pause there. I did, because you're pastoring and going to school at the same time. But finally finished.
That's right. Congratulations.
Degree, my master's program. And I really enjoyed your class. I think I took one class with you, Foundations of Personal and Professional Ministry. Is that right?
Something like that. I think we changed the name last year.
PPTFM.
Formation for Ministry.
Oh, that's easier.
Much more simple.
But it was great because it was not only biblical and scriptural, but it was really focused on the Holy Spirit and on emotional health and well-being.
Right. That's right.
And you had us do some exercises. And when I came up through the Bible college system. And 4 years of Bible college, and you're trained for ministry totally. There was no, very little, if any, training on your own soulical health.
That's right.
Nothing about how do you deal with the pain of ministry. It was just, buck up and push through. Jesus will get you through. In fact, in one of the schools that I went to, there was almost they looked down on folks that went to see counselors or tried to get help as being weak spiritually. I never bought that. I never bought into that idea, but I simply had to teach myself how to be emotionally healthy and find that in other ways after I started in ministry. So that's a big part of what you have brought to the seminary.
Right, because I think we've all seen pastors that become brains on sticks.
Yep.
They develop their head and they know the Bible, they know theology, but they're, as C.S. Lewis says, men without chests. And they've lost the ability to be real, to be honest, and to be healthy. And so at the seminary, and I've learned this through the years, our educational foundation is biblical and theological formation, spiritual formation. We want to form them in the spirit, and that includes emotional health. And then the missional formation is part of that as well. It's got to be practical. And so every ATS student is required to attend counseling. I have them do a grief journal where they process loss.
Do you get some kickback on that sometimes?
Never.
Really?
Never.
Wow.
And the reason is that it's after they've gone through my class, and we've talked about grieving, we've talked about dealing with loss, we've talked about how if you're going to be in ministry, as you've said already, you're going to be processing loss all the time. And if you as a pastor and as a leader don't know how to do that for yourself, how can you lead others in it?
You can't.
And so once I do that teaching with them, and I send them to counseling, and actually if they're there, they can do free counseling through our marriage and family therapy internship program. Most of them do more than the required 5 sessions. Most of them stay with it the entire time they're in seminary, because I tell them, you're never going to get free counseling again. You're going to have to pay for it.
Right.
So take advantage of this. And so I think the result is we have been graduating men and women who are in a much better place to start ministry because we've taught them how to deal with loss before the loss starts hitting them.
That's it. I don't think anybody understands how important what you're saying is.
Yeah.
Because when you think about ministry, as a young minister or a church planner, you're thinking about the victories, you're thinking about your vision, you're thinking about your programs, the products you're offering, whatever it is, you're thinking about your next message, and it's all positive. You have hope, and that's you wouldn't try starting a church unless you were a person of a certain amount of insanity,
right,
and crazy faith, right? You've got to step out. But the reality is, you hit up against loss immediately.
Sure.
I mean, I remember when we started our church, the first year we had this beautiful little congregation. It was growing, and there was this couple, and they were the top givers in the church. They were just professionals, good friends of ours. And after a year, they came up and said, "We feel like we're done here, and our time here is over." And it was really hard.
Yeah.
But there were certain things that we were called to do that they were not in agreement with.
Right.
And it was a necessary loss.
Yeah.
And we parted ways well. We're still friends to this day. But it was hard.
Sure.
And that was my first real member loss I experienced, certainly not my last. And then over the years as pastors, you have people that, come and they feel called to another church or called to another community, and they communicate with you in a healthy way, and you release them with a blessing. But there's a whole lot of folks that don't do that.
That's right.
And so you experience losses, and sometimes you find out about it after the fact.
Right.
Sometimes months after the fact if it's a larger church. And then sometimes there's no goodbye. And loss is about saying goodbye, isn't it?
Yes. And if you let those things pile up without processing them, then you kind of become like the dog that jerks every time somebody reaches to pet it because it's been beat so many times.
Yeah.
And so those disappointments, those rejections, those feelings of abandonment, they begin to pile up, and then you begin to live controlled in your present and future by the losses from your past. And that's why processing those losses well is so important.
I can't tell you how much this is speaking to me. You taught this morning in our staff chapel about processing grief and loss, and you said some fantastic things. But since we're talking to pastors now, I want to just kind of ask you some key questions about grief and how do we integrate it.
Yeah.
I came up in the Pentecostal charismatic tradition, the faith tradition, and we were taught that, and I didn't buy into this, as I said, but it was something that was regularly taught, that grieving was a spirit to be resisted. That grieving was submission to the enemy. If you were grieving, you were stuck. And if you really believe the Bible, if somebody dies, they go to be with the Lord, and if they aren't, well, then then you need to, just move on and preach the gospel harder so that more people will make it to heaven.
Right.
A prominent teacher in our tradition, back when I was in school, wrote a book, and it literally was a book that was saying that grief is a spirit, and if you grieve, you're going to be overcome by this demonic spirit and get stuck. And so what you're saying is very different than I think even some people that are still in that mindset think, the ways they think. And so why is grieving a scriptural and even necessary part of our lives as shepherds?
Well, when we read the Bible, we find what we want to find, don't we? Often we read it through lenses and presuppositions, and we are blinded to the reality of what is actually there by those presuppositions. That's one of the principles of hermeneutics. You have to understand that we all have presuppositions. So if you're reading it with that kind of a presupposition that grieving is evil, grieving is wrong, you miss most of Psalms because they're Psalms of lament.
Yes,
that are full of the Psalms. The psalmist was very honest about disappointment, loss. He even got angry in a few Psalms.
Oh, yes, he did.
Which is a form of kind of getting what's on the inside out.
Prayed for his enemies to be destroyed.
Yeah, that's right. The baby smashed against the rocks and everything else.
Intense.
Total out of control. Know? But yet God used that to process what was going on in his heart. You can't read Lamentations as a giant grief journal. And so you see the prophets being honest with God, with disappointment. Even Elijah, after he's had this great victory, he runs off to the desert and basically is grieving and lamenting. And so you see it all through the Scripture. Then you see it in Jesus.
Jonah, I love the story of Jonah, right?
Yeah.
He finally gets obedient, preaches the gospel, it's effective, and then he's ticked off.
Yeah, he was grieving because it was effective. He didn't want them to see.
He wanted them to die.
Yeah, that's right.
So just kill me now.
Yeah.
I have one translation where Jonah says, just kill me now, take my life.
Yeah.
So
now that is an example of kind of an unhealthy grieving, because I think we would have to add there is a grieving that is healthy and right and leads to hope.
Okay.
But there's also a grieving that leads to unbelief and kind of a negative place. And I think maybe those men and women from your past that taught the way they taught saw the unhealthy grieving.
Absolutely.
And that's what they were talking about. And so certainly there is an unhealthy way to grieve where you keep your eye on the loss and the disappointment and never get your eyes on the Lord.
And we've seen that, as shepherds, we've all dealt with people who've experienced loss and they just get stuck.
Right.
Right. So how do we need to coach people and ourselves out of the valley.
Yeah.
But how do you walk through the valley?
Yeah. Well, I think you look at Jesus, even when the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept, is there at the funeral of Lazarus. Now, I have a suspicion that the Father had already prompted Jesus, that he knew this was going to end in victory, but he still engages in the grieving process with people.
Yeah.
And so there's empathy, there is a connection there. He, again, as we quoted this morning, he's a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, acquainted with pain. He's not unfamiliar with it. And so he never runs away from it, but in the process, he always turns to the Lord. He always turns to the Father. And so I think if we can help people turn to the Father, who is not going to say, get over it, move on, I've got a call on your life. No, he's going to help them process it in a healthy way. He's going to help them grow through it. And the depth of your loss will determine the length of your season of grief.
Now, talk about that. That's important.
I mean, you're going to experience losses every week. I may say something to you today like, man, that's one of the ugliest shirts I've ever seen, Josh, or John. And that's kind of a hurtful thing. I would never say that. It's actually a nice shirt. But we may need to process some things, even in the course of relationship where, wow, when Ron said that today, that was a little hurtful. Now, is it at a level that you and I need to talk about it and process it? Or is it a level that you can kind of say, I'm going to process that and let it go, okay? And I think some things that we experience, we can just deal with it on us and the Lord.
Yeah, you talk to the Lord and just let it go.
And process it. But at the same time, we don't bury it. We process it.
Right.
I tell
Describe that, because that's important.
Yeah. Well,
how would you define processing?
Well, so I tell the story of, I use the same example when I'm in class. I say, if I say something hurtful to one of you who are my students, and I say something a little mean-spirited, maybe I'm sarcastic with you, and then I realize I've hurt you, and I say, hey, would you forgive me? If you say, oh, sure, I forgive you, but you never deal with the pain of what I did to you,
right,
then the feelings that you're experiencing are real.
Because we're Christians and we're supposed to forgive.
Right. And so what would be honest and fair for you to do is to say, Ron, yeah, I'm on the road to forgiving you, but could we sit down and talk about why you said what you said?
Oh, yes.
Because you're a mentor to me, and your words have power. Yeah. And so those stung me deeply. Mm-hmm. So, I would applaud that. That's a person that's being honest, and they have a right to sit down and talk and, in essence, grieve and process what has just happened so that they can come out the other side stronger.
I think one of the reasons this is such an important topic for me is when I was 16, I was going on a date with my two brothers and a friend to pick up some girls, and there was a woman coming out the direction. She'd had too much to drink. She spun out in front of us, and we hit her. My older brother was instantly killed, and I was nearly killed. And the next thing I remember predominantly was waking up in the hospital and finding out that my brother had died. And immediately, the Christians in the church came over to our home, came to our bedside, and because I was still recovering, and said, my brother's name is Scott. Scott's in heaven. He's in heaven now. We have to move on. We have to lead people to Christ. And there was no space made for this uncomfortable feeling of the incredible loss of my, at this time, 18-year-old brother.
Turn it into a testimony.
Turn your test into a testimony.
Yeah.
And we want to do that, right?
Yeah.
So I did. I just kind of put it aside, went forward, jumped into my calling in ministry, went to Bible college, graduated a year later, went to Bible college, and have been going hard for God ever since. But never, I thought I grieved, I guess, I went to the funeral, I felt sad a few times, but it was later in life, much later in life, where that grief came knocking at my door.
Right.
And as I was dealing with other people who had experienced losses, I found myself emotionally not able to really enter into it with them, almost afraid to.
Yeah.
And I had to sit down and do some work on myself and realize I hadn't said goodbye. I needed to. Grieving is the process of saying goodbye. I needed to say goodbye.
Yeah, and it's. We said this morning that a lot of Christians, they push the grief down, they bury it, they hide it, they live in denial, and it's like trying to push a beach ball down under the water. It might not come up where you've pushed it down because your hands are there holding it, but it's coming up behind your back. It's coming up in other places.
Sooner or later, it's coming up.
And so you can't really avoid. There's actually a book called The Body Doesn't Lie. And whatever you go through in terms of trauma, if you don't deal with it well, if you don't get healing, it begins to be exposed in your body.
It's amazing, though. Sometimes I find in working with people as a shepherd that the unprocessed trauma and grief doesn't surface until they're in their mid-30s or 40s. And suddenly life begins to become unmanageable.
Yeah.
And they can't quite put their finger on it, and often it's stuff that they just have never processed.
Yeah, and for me, what triggered it was my children.
Talk about that.
I'll never forget my daughter, and we were teaching them the right things. We were teaching them how to process their emotions and everything.
Not to deny them.
Yeah, but we hadn't done it ourselves yet. And so I think my daughter was 3 or 4, and her name was Karis, and she spilled her milk, and I just went off. Karis, what is wrong with you? The parental shame question. And I'll never forget, she looked at me, and I still think to this day it was a prophetic word. It was too wise just to come from a 3-year-old. She looked at me and she goes, "What's wrong with me? I'm 3 and I spilled my milk." "What's wrong with you, Dad?" And I went,
wisdom right there.
Yeah. And I'm like, okay.
Out of the mouths of
She
babes.
is prophetic, okay. But I realized that my anger that was coming out at my children was rooted in childhood stuff that I had not resolved. I had never grieved the way I was treated as a preacher's kid, the way there was manipulation. There was shame. Now, my parents were not drug addicts. They didn't, beat me beyond what I did. Well, sometimes they beat me beyond what I deserved, I think.
Back in those days, spanking was a part of the toolkit, right?
But there were things that I had never dealt with. I had basically, what happens in the pastor's home stays in the pastor's home. Well, I understand there's a certain amount that you need to do that when you're with a church, but that became, you never talk about it. You never deal with it.
Right.
And so I had to go through a process when I was doing my doctorate where I did a 35-page grief journal on things about my childhood that I had never processed.
Now, what is that, a grief journal?
Thanks for joining us for part 1 of this episode of the Shepherds Podcast. And don't miss out on part 2 with Dr. Ron Walborn as he continues to teach on pastoring through grief and loss. For more resources and podcast episodes, you can check us out online at theshepherdsnetwork.com or on our YouTube channel.